and we'll just go. So welcome. As we know, this is the long-awaited masterclass with Greywacke from New Zealand with Kevin Judd. It's an incredible honor. I attended the Wines of New Zealand SomCon sort of buyers forum about 2 months ago, Kevin, and you were on the program along with a couple of your colleagues representing New Zealand wines.
Oh,
and
okay.
The speaker was a wonderful guy, young, very enthusiastic, and he was, over the moon that you were part of the panel. But he didn't really do, in my opinion, an nearly adequate job of really highlighting how incredible it was to have you join. Now, and I say that because truthfully, Kevin is a legend when it comes to making wine in New Zealand. And I know it's sort of weird to hear people say that when you're sitting right there, Kevin, but to explain to the consumer, New Zealand wine wouldn't be what it is today without Kevin's influence and vision and foresight and guidance. So we are absolutely ourselves over the moon thrilled to share these wines with you and to share this experience with you. So I'll step back immediately. We have a lot to cover, even though we only have 3 wines. There's just so much information to share and wines to taste and sort of think about. So Jaron, I'll introduce you. Jaron represents Lanterna, and he is the reason why we're here tonight, because he's made great efforts to make the connections so that we could host this event. Jaron, if you want to jump on mic and tell us a little bit about Lanterna, who you are, and introduce Kevin.
Great. Thank you, Antoinette, as always. And yeah, so being with Lanterna, which is a family-owned company based out of Baltimore, we were lucky enough, I guess it's almost 2 years now, maybe even a little bit more, that we've picked up Obridge Cellars, which is an importer based out of Australia that Kevin is a part of. And when we picked up these Greywacke wines, it was such a pleasure and such a delight. And in fact, we really needed some really cool New Zealand, Australian stuff to begin with. But, my background, some of you know me, some of you don't, but I come from 25 years in super high-end restaurants. And I've really kind of used my kind of sommelier experience to put that into making sure Antoinette has the right things for you to see and the right people to see. So she doesn't get to see all of our wines, but the ones that are fantastic that I think everyone on this broadcast will love is why we're here. So Kevin, of course, I know we didn't go into it yet, and I know you're going to take the mic for a while, but as Antoinette said, and I know it's weird to hear it because no one's ever said it to me, but you are a legend in the business. And, he'll go into a little bit of history and of not only the winery, but who he is. And we get to watch a little video as well, which I know he probably took a large part of, being that he has a photography background as well, or photography hobby, or I don't know. I know you're very famous for your photos too. But with that being said, Kevin, please, the show is yours.
Right. Sorry, I'll just jump in. I know, Kevin, you requested to have that video stream before we get to hear your melodic voice. So I'll go ahead and post that up now. So give us a second to share screen. And guys, we have about a sort of a 2-minute video here.
So Marlborough is situated at the very northern end of the South Island of New Zealand. We have a very maritime climate. The temperature rarely exceeds 30 degrees centigrade, even in the middle of summer, but we get very high sunshine hours and very intense sunlight. The concept of terroir involves this combination of the soil and climate of a wine region. More recently, it's been suggested that the human influence is also very much part of the terroir of a wine district. At Greywacke, we like to take that one step further and suggest that microflora is in fact also part of the terroir. The yeast, the bacteria, are indeed part of the terroir of Marlborough. So I first started making wine in New Zealand in 1983, and I first moved to Marlborough in 1985. So I've been making wine in Marlborough for a long time. After 25 years in my previous role, I decided it was time. I turned 50 and I realized it was now or never. So in 2009, Kimberly and I established Greywacke.
Greywacke was established in 2009. The reason we called the vineyard Greywacke was it was full of these Greywacke stones. Our vineyard back in '89 that we had was very, very stony, and so we found the name Greywacke actually in the dictionary and decided to call the vineyard Greywacke, and that's where we've come from.
And Richard Ellis joined us, about 2 years ago?
Greywacke is a really young company, but I think we've come a long way in a short space of time. We're certainly not complacent, and one thing that we do in the winery a lot of is experimenting. And in fact, one of the first things Kevin said to me when I started was, like, if you want to experiment with any of the wines, by all means, let me know. And we've taken that philosophy, and every year we're trying to be a little bit different. We're trying to take the things that we really liked from the previous vintage and do a bit more of that the following. So we're certainly not resting on our laurels. It's about, constantly innovating and trying to push the boundary. Our winemaking style at Greywacke is quite minimal intervention, quite hands-off. I think one thing that we've learned over the years is what not to worry about as opposed to what to worry about.
With all the wines we make at Greywacke, we're trying to make a style of wine that is very specific to the variety.
The style of Sauvignon Blanc that we're looking to make here at Greywacke is a lot riper than has traditionally come out of the Marlborough region.
So we're working with beautiful mature vineyards. We're growing the fruit in nice open canopies, a little bit of dappled light onto the fruit.
Stylistically, we're very much moving away from the green, grassy, herbaceous styles of Sauvignon Blanc. And it's not to say that they're not good, it's just not the style that we're looking to make.
So it's harvested in April 1 year, and it's released in the October of that same year. Whereas the wild is very different, and giving it the name wild, we were hoping that people would realise that just looking at the label, there's something a little bit different about this wine.
With the wild Sauvignon, we literally put the juice into old barrels and go and do something else. We leave it to its own devices. So this is very hands-off winemaking. This is
cross our fingers and walk away for a year and just hope that the wild yeast that happen to be living on the grapes and that have been transferred into the juice as we've pressed them will kick into gear and do their thing.
Which is not something they taught me to do at Roseworthy College, I can assure you.
What we love with the use of wild fermentation and old oak barrels is that it gives us a far more floral, nutty, savoury style of Sauvignon Blanc.
So Greywacke Pinot Noir is a very aromatic, spicy style of Pinot. We source our fruit entirely from the Southern Valleys.
Pinot, for me, is the variety I'm the most excited about from Marlborough. For a long time, as a region, we've been growing Pinot vines in the wrong locations. We've had the wrong clones. And for good reason, a lot of the world have disregarded us as a Pinot producing region. About 20 years ago, we imported better clones from Burgundy. We started growing up onto the hillside vineyards in the Southern Valleys. And that's where all of the fruit for our Pinot Noir comes from.
We do produce other wines. We produce Chardonnay, Pinot Gris and Riesling.
Across the board, what we're looking to achieve with all of our wines here at Greywacke is a really right, layered style of wine. We're trying to showcase the best that Marlborough can do.
So the images on the labels are all images from my first book, which was called The Colour of Wine, which we published in 1999. In my final 5 years in my last role, I was 2/3 winemaker, 1/3 photographer. My wine photography hero was a guy called Mick Rock in London. And one day he came to visit me to take photographs. I relished the opportunity to meet him, and I showed him some of my pictures, and he invited me to contribute to his library, and that was a turning point, really. That's when it went from being just a hobby to being more semi-commercial sort of a thing. Wine is a very subjective thing, like anything, and that's where I think it sort of is wine an art or a science? It's both, really. I mean, you have to have an understanding of science to make wine, but at the end of the day, you're creating something that is being judged by someone's senses. There's an art in that.
Right. And there we are. Welcome, Kevin Judd.
Thank you. So hopefully that paints a little bit of a picture about where we are and what it looks like.
Absolutely. And since we're all together, and since it's evening here, before we get started into your lecture, Kevin, I encourage everyone to go ahead and pour your wines into glasses. If you have 3 glasses, great. If you have just the one, just get that Sauvignon Blanc started. You'd like to start with the Sauv Blanc or the Chard today, Kevin?
We normally start with the Sauvignon Blanc and then.
Okay.
Actually, just remind me, do you have both Sauvignon Blancs or just
the wild?
Just the wild, yeah.
Yeah.
We normally go wild Sauvignon, Chardonnay, and then Pinot.
Okay. So that will be the order for tonight, guys. And go ahead and pour out your wines, swirl them around. They've been trapped inside those small bottles for quite some time. So give them the opportunity to take a deep breath of oxygen and get their aromatics moving for you. And Kevin, I hand over the screen and the mic to you. And please tell us about Greywacke.
All right, so well, to start with, I'll just talk about where we are. So we're down here at the very top end of the South Island of New Zealand, totally and utterly surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. And it's quite interesting that we're actually, if you think about the sort of wine we make in Marlborough, and you think about the Northern Hemisphere, and you might wonder about the sort of latitude that we would be at. And when you think about France and the sort of wines they make there and the regions that we're talking about, you might think that we were in a similar sort of latitude to perhaps somewhere through the middle of Burgundy or the Loire, or perhaps even as high up as Champagne. But in fact, we're at latitude 41.5 degrees south. And in the Northern Hemisphere, 41.5 doesn't even go through France. It goes through the middle of Italy and Spain. So the climate is cool here. These days it gets over 30 degrees sometimes during the summer, but it's not a common occurrence. If it gets to 32, it's a really hot day. It used to be 30 degrees was a really hot day, but with climate change, we're getting sometimes to 32, but it just doesn't get hotter than that because we're completely surrounded by ocean. But at latitude 41.5 south, the sun is very high in the sky, like it might be halfway down Italy. So we get very, very intense sunlight, and we have very clear air. So we get this. We've got cool temperature, but intense and lots of sunshine hours. So the fruit actually gets very ripe, but because we have all this sunshine, but it gets ripe in this cooler climate, so without excessive heat. So we get this incredible retention of aromatics and acid, which is really the key to why we make the sort of wines that we do, and why we get the intensity of varietal character, and why we get such sort of crisp acidity. It's all about the climate. I mean, the soils, excuse me, the soils are obviously part of the picture, as the winemakers, and as I say in the video, the natural yeast that we like to use. In fact, all 3 of these wines you're tasting today are 100% wild yeast. So there's been no addition of cultured yeast or bacteria. So the terroir, these days we think of the terroir as being a combination of all those things, but by far the main influencer for the wines that we make here is the climate, and it's a very maritime climate, which without high maximum temperatures, but with lots of sunshine. And I mean, on the downside, because we're down in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean, we do get quite a bit of variability in climate. And in the one thing that they say about global warming or climate change is that we can expect more sort of cyclonic patterns, which are very hard to manage in a place like this, because high rainfall, high humidity is our main problem. Botrytis is our main issue with Sauvignon Blanc growing in Marlborough. So we don't really want those sorts of things, but yeah. So that's where we're at. So everyone knows where New Zealand is, I hope. I don't need to tell you that. I've met some people that don't. They get New Zealand and Tasmania confused. Yeah, so New Zealand is 2 main islands. We're, as I said, we're at the top of the South Island. We've got a population in New Zealand of 5 million people. We talk about the North Island, the South Island, and the West Island. The West Island being Australia. Our culture is sort of has some similarities with Australia, but New Zealanders are fiercely not Australian, especially when it comes to rugby. So that's where we are, and that's the climate. In terms of history, I am now a New Zealander. I became a naturalized Kiwi last year, although I've been here since 1983, so I certainly think of myself as a New Zealander. But prior to that, I was brought up in Australia, in Adelaide, and prior to that, I was actually born in England, and my parents emigrated to Australia when I was 9. So I'm a bit of a mixture. My accent's a little bit screwed up. But anyway, I've been in New Zealand since '83. When we came to New Zealand, the idea was that we would come here for 3 years, get some experience in the cool climate, and then go back to Australia. But that never happened because I met a guy called David Honan, who offered me a job with a new. Well, he had this idea to create this new winery, and in fact, he hadn't. When I first met him, he hadn't decided whether he was going to go to Hawke's Bay or Marlborough. We ended up going to Marlborough, and we established a new company which became Cloudy Bay. So I was in the right place at the right time, and I was very, very fortunate to have the opportunity to be the founding winemaker at Cloudy Bay, and I was in charge of winemaking there for 25 vintages. So that was an incredible journey. When we started that company, it was owned by David Honan and his brother's company, and the company that I left was owned by Moet Hennessy, global luxury company, and it was quite a transformation, but it happened over a period of 25 years, so it was a very slow, gradual change. But the company I left was internationally well known, and it was. I feel very privileged to have been part of that. But I turned 50 and I was a bit fed up with looking at spreadsheets and talking to HR and marketing and financial people. So in 2009, I left Cloudy Bay to set up Greywacke. So we actually registered the name Greywacke in 1993. Because we owned a vineyard which we called Greywacke, and we registered the name and the idea that we might one day make a Judd family label, and but it took 17 years for that to actually happen. So we already had the name. When I left Cloudy Bay, I didn't have much. I didn't have a vineyard or a lot of money. But I had some friends that we'd worked together at Cloudy Bay who had established Dog Point Winery. And so when I left Cloudy Bay, I sort of teamed up with Dog Point. And even to this point today, we still source probably about 75% of our fruit from the family, the Sutherland family, who own Dog Point. So Ivan Sutherland and I worked at Cloudy Bay for many, many years. So at Greywacke we don't actually own our own winery as such, but our story is not about a fancy architecturally designed winery or a specific piece of vineyard dirt. It's our story is about our winemaking, and the Marlborough region. So I like to think that we're working with some really lovely vineyards, some really mature vineyards, and I've got very specific ideas what I like in a vineyard, and how I like the fruit to be managed, how I like the canopy to be managed, how I like the vineyards to be managed, and when to pick the fruit. And I've got very specific ideas about the sort of styles we want to make, and we have access to some superb vineyards. But as I say, we don't need to own the tanks. We own the barrels, we own the wine, we own the winemaking expertise. So that's what Greywacke is all about. We make a total of 7 wines, and we've made 7 wines since day one. We don't export them all to the States, but we export the 2 Sauvignon Blancs, Chardonnay, and Pinot Noir to the US at this point. The US is quite a complicated market because you've got so many, you've got the importer and the distributor and all the states, and it's and a lot of the distributors we work with are quite big companies, so it tends the decision was made to focus on the sort of core part of our portfolio. The wines that we don't export to the States tend to be quite small production. But these days, since 2009, our business has expanded reasonably significantly, but it's got to the point now where we're not sort of expanding. Well, in fact, last year we unexpanded quite significantly. We had a very, very small harvest, but we export to now I think somewhere around 50 countries. So we export about 96% of our production, which is quite a complicated business for a team of 7. Which is all we have. So we have 3 people in the production side, which includes me, and then a few people in the sort of sales marketing side, which also includes me, and then a logistics person and a financial person, and that's us. So it's a very small, and three of us are Judd family members. So it really is quite a small. Whereas, I mean, we're considered a medium-sized company in the scheme of New Zealand wine, but we're at the sort of smaller end of medium, and very much a family-owned business. So that's who we are and where we came from and where we are. So should we talk about each of the wines one by one?
Yes, let's absolutely go into that. But the one question I have before we start is, how did your time at Cloudy Bay shape your vision for Greywacke?
Oh, how long do we have? Well, the winemaker that left Cloudy Bay was not the same winemaker that arrived. The way I made wine when I arrived at Cloudy Bay was not wrong, but it was formed largely on sort of modern winemaking techniques. It was all about squeaky clean winemaking, fruit-driven wines, fairly sort of. I was sort of brought up I went to Roseworthy in Australia, and in the days that I was there, and in the days that I made wine for a little while in Australia, it was all about technology and keeping oxygen away from juice, and it was a very specific style of making wine. And I mean, we made good wines, but when I left Cloudy Bay, I was making wine in a completely different fashion. Some of the things were kept, but I'd learned over the period of time what not to worry about, and that the anaerobic way of handling juice is just not the best way of doing it. And I learned what was some of the things that became a lot more important to me, are like the way you manage the pressing of juice, volume, the volume that you extract, all those sorts of things have a huge influence on sort of longevity. So lots of learnings from just making wine. I mean, you can go to Roseworthy and do a 3-year degree, but you don't learn how to make wine. Well, you learn how to make, you do learn how to make wine, but you don't. It takes years and years to learn how to create wines that you like. Do you know what I mean? That sort of suit what you are aiming to do. But the other thing I learned in the days of Cloudy Bay, of course, is the world is when I left Cloudy Bay to set up Greywacke, as far as I was concerned, the world was our market. I wasn't just aiming to supply New Zealand. There's only 5 million people in New Zealand, and there's a hell of a lot of Sauvignon Blanc being produced in Marlborough. To think that I could, to establish a business and only sell in New Zealand would have been lunacy. And when I left Cloudy Bay, of course, I was very fortunate to have, well, I had, as some people would say, I had various reputations, but I had a fairly good reputation for making wine, and that was also a global, that had global reach. So it was a no-brainer to look to the whole world as our market, which is what we did. But in 2009, of course, we had the unfortunate timing thing of trying to set up a new company in the middle of a global financial crisis. So, and one of the casualties of that was trying to find an American importer. It took 3 years to find someone to import us. I'm still waiting for replies from some of the emails I sent in 2009. No one wanted to know about a new brand from New Zealand in 2009 in the US. But I eventually got hooked up with the guys at Old Bridge Cellars, and they started off life as an Australian wine specialist, but we were actually their first venture outside of Australia, I think. They now have a couple of labels from us from New Zealand, and they have labels from the US and from Europe. So they've expanded quite significantly, but they started off life as an Australian specialist.
Excellent. Thank you so much for answering that. Guys, I'm just going to share my screen so we can introduce the first wine here. And this first wine is the Wild Sauvignon Blanc. So, oh, sorry, I guess I have to flick through the whole. So we did create a PowerPoint for you, but we decided to just have a chat with Kevin. So ignore all of that stuff. And here we are. Kevin, if you'd like to introduce the Wild Sauvignon.
Yeah, so I guess a few of you, if not all of you, would realize that we make, in fact, the biggest part of our business, 70%, somewhere between 60 and 70% of the Greywacke business is actually Greywacke Sauvignon Blanc rather than Wild Sauvignon. And about 80% of our business is composed of the 2 Sauvignon Blancs. So, but the 2 Sauvignon Blancs that we make are very, very, very different from each other. The Greywacke Sauvignon Blanc, which is not the one you're tasting today, is what we consider to be our take on the sort of classic Marlborough style. So it's not as punchy, and it's a sort of a turned down, more textural version of the classic Marlborough style, but it's all about fruit. It's all about trying to capture what this region delivers, and it's in a style that's quite familiar, although quite different. And as I say, the volume's turned down, the acid's not too high. But anyway, so that's what we're mainly known for. But the other Sauvignon Blanc style, which we're tasting today, which we actually consider to be our signature wine, even though it's not the main part of our business. This is Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc done in a totally different way, and this is Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc in a style that we make, in the style that we like. And it's because there's so many different winemaking techniques involved in making this wine. And well, I should say there's an evolving category which people are calling the alternative styles of Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, and they might be wines barrel fermented, wild yeast, malolactic. There's lots of different ways you can sort of create wines that are different. And when you start applying all those different techniques, you start to get a whole range of different styles. So this style is very specific to us, and this is absolutely 100% wild yeast. So the fruit, we handle the fruit the same in terms of the vineyard source. This wine is not different from the other wine because of vineyard or site. It's different because of winemaking technique. We source Sauvignon Blanc from about 12 different vineyard sites, and we have some favorites for the wild Sauvignon, but it's not sort of it's not a set specific, there's not set sites that we use for either. But the fruit is grown the same way, it's picked at roughly the same time, and it's handled the same way in the harvesting technique and the winery. But the difference is after the juice has been settled, rather than rack into stainless steel tanks and inoculate with cultured yeast, we rack into barrels, mainly old barrels, and we don't add anything. We just put the juice in the barrel and carry on, go and do something else. And so the juice sits there for probably the thick end of 2 weeks before it starts to ferment. Normally when you inoculate a fermentation, it's going in on the 3rd day, it's usually rolling. The whole tank is a rolling fermentation. This takes 2 weeks for it to kick in. And then during that time, the yeast that largely, I mean, we can't tell for sure, but we believe these are the yeast from the vineyard, and I'm pretty damn sure of that. The yeast from the vineyard, because they're in such small numbers on the fruit, it takes a time for them to build up. So that's what that 2 weeks, that's what happens during that 2 weeks. The natural yeast or the wild yeast or the indigenous yeast, whatever you want to call them, are gradually building up numbers and getting ready to ferment. And then it eventually kicks off. And we don't try and control this fermentation. The juice is in relatively small barrels, so in the temperature here during that sort of period of time is usually reasonably cool. Autumn is definitely kicking in, or fall as you call it, by that stage. So ambient temperatures aren't that hot. So the wines don't ferment much more than it gets into the low 20s, and we just let it ferment at whatever it likes to do. We don't actually pay much attention to it at all. This is pretty easy, cheap winemaking. But the thing, so the barrel's only got a couple of 100 litres. There's 200 litres in a 225 litre barrel to give it a bit of space so it doesn't try and get out. And then so at the end of once the fermentation slows right down, we top the barrels up, and then we top them every month, every 4 to 6 weeks during the year. But that's about all we do. And the wine stays in barrel for 12 months. And during that time, I should say this is getting a little bit geeky, but I'm pretty sure you're interested in a bit of detail. At the start of the fermentation, when there's no alcohol in the juice, if you look through the microscope at what's growing in the juice, it's like a microbiological zoo. I mean, there's all sorts of creatures in there growing, all sorts of different types of yeast. And we don't know what they are. And to be quite honest, I'm not that worried about specifically what these types of yeast are. But what happens is once the fermentation kicks in and once the alcohol starts to increase, the type of yeast gets narrowed down. And when you look through the microscope in the middle of this fermentation, it looks like an inoculated fermentation, because this sort of a wine, alcohol tolerant wine yeast has taken over. So the microorganisms at the beginning and the microorganisms in the middle of fermentation are quite different. And we think, and what we believe, we know, that a lot of that sort of slightly funky, wild character that we love actually comes from the microbiological zoo at the beginning of this whole process. And the yeast that converts the sugar into alcohol during the primary part of the fermentation is not quite as important as what happens at the beginning. So we like to just leave the juice in the barrel and wait. Rather than what some winemakers do, and I'm not saying it's wrong, it's just different, is that some winemakers, they like to get a fermentation going. In fact, even some winemakers will go out and crush some juice in the vineyard and get it going in a bucket and then bring it in and inoculate. If you do that, you're certainly using wild yeast, but you've selected the yeast that's already in the fermentation phase rather than letting all the other creatures grow in the juice while you're waiting for it to start fermenting. That's how we do it. And then but the wild yeast that do the primary part of the fermentation are also, because they're not cultured, they haven't been grown in a factory that grows specific yeast with specific characteristics. They're not grown, they're not alcohol tolerant, or they're not necessarily alcohol tolerant. It's not a precise science. None of this is a precise science, but some of the fermentations will go dry within, say, 3 or 4 months, but some of the fermentations just kick on. In fact, I was having a discussion with Rochelle, who's winemaker here, about we've got a tank of wine that sort of decided to stick at about 6 grams. It's only one tank, so once we blend it away, hopefully we'll get to about where we want. But it's just decided that it's going to stop because the yeast have had enough. But the wine that we've still got in barrel, Wild Sauvignon from 2021, some of it's as high as 20 grams per litre still, and it'll just keep ticking away as the cellars warm up now with summer coming on. It'll just, and hopefully by the time we pull the wine out of barrel in February, it'll all be dry enough. If it's not, we'll have to get the fermentations to go dry in the tank after we've taken it out of barrel. So we change our winemaking timing and to some degree techniques from year to year, depending on what sort of nature gives us in the way of wild yeast fermentations. It's not something that's quite as easy to control. So you need a bit of patience and you need some flexibility to make wine like this. It's not quite so easy to manage from a production point of view. We use a tiny amount of wild fermentation with the Greywacke Sauvignon Blanc, but it's only like about 10%. And to be honest, I don't tell everyone this, but that 10% is actually made the previous year. So it's a little reserve blended component that we put in the wine.
Very cool. So we'll move on to the Sauvignon Blanc, the Chardonnay here. And I'll leave this screen up for a little bit and then I'll stop share so we can see you talking, Kevin. So have a go at it. So we don't ship a lot of Chardonnay to the US. It's like, as I say, Colt in Newcastle, I guess. There's a lot of Chardonnay made in the US, but we make a very, very different style in Marlborough, and it's frustrating. I mean, we and I am very thankful that I'm making Sauvignon Blanc in Marlborough, and Marlborough is famous for Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, that's a really good thing for Marlborough to be famous for something, and for the whole world to enjoy drinking the wines that we make from Sauvignon Blanc in Marlborough. But on the other flip side of that, it's sort of frustrating
that it seems, particularly in the US, I must say, that the strength, the power of the association between Marlborough and Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand is that it's very hard to sell anything else other than Sauvignon Blanc. Our Chardonnay gets better scores, and yet we sell, in the US, we sell like 1% or something, or 1 or 2% of what we sell Sauvignon Blanc. It's crazy. The Chardonnay in Marlborough, I mean, if I tell you I'm about to pour you a Chardonnay, it's 14.5% alcohol. It's been in barrel for 12 months. It's had a full malolactic. You're sort of getting, you'd be conjuring up pictures in your head and your brain of something quite sort of fat and rich and you know, really like a high alcohol barrel fermented full malolactic Chardonnay might taste. But this Greywacke Sauvignon, this Greywacke Chardonnay is all of those things. It is high alcohol, or relatively high alcohol for a white wine. It is 100% malolactic, and it's fermented in barrel. 20% of the barrels are new, and we only use barrels from one cooper in south of Burgundy called Tonnelia de Mercure, who make what I consider to be extremely good. I like that sort of slightly meaty, bacony sort of character from the toast that these guys use. But it's a very tight, grapefruity, smoky, flinty. It's not got a huge amount of acid, but it is very dry and very crisp and very. It's definitely not what you'd expect from the numbers. You know what I mean? It's not big. It doesn't taste like a. It's all. That's once again. That's well. It's a lot of that's about climate, but it's also in fact, it's mainly about climate. The clone that we use is predominantly what we down here call the Mendoza clone, and in your part of the world, in California, they would call that, or they would call it would be very, very similar in lots of respects to what they call the Wente clone, and in Western Australia they call it the Gingin clone. And all of those clones came one way or another from Davis, and they've all got the same trait of having a propensity for millerandage or hen and chicken, so the different sized berries. So you get normal sized berries, and in some years you get a lot of little tiny weeny berries. But for us in this district, the hallmarks of it are just amazing concentration of flavor and very high acid. A lot of Mendoza in Marlborough has been pulled out because some winemakers just don't like the amount of acidity. But if you put it through, if you get it nice and ripe, and that's what 14.5% alcohol is all about. If you get it really ripe, and you put it through a full malolactic, it just makes incredibly powerful wine with good balance. And I don't, you know, this wine hasn't got a lot. It hasn't got too much acid, but it's certainly got enough. And if we made a 13% wine out of these grapes and put it through malolactic, it would still be very hard to drink because it would have a lot of acid. So I mean, this wine is so we handpick the fruit in the case of Chardonnay. In fact, we handpick some of the Sauvignon Blanc, but we don't handpick. Most of it is picked by machine, but we're very, very particular about the types of machine and who's driving the machine and the condition of the vineyard before the machine goes in. We are very anal about all those things. But at the end of the day, Sauvignon Blanc has a very thin skin, and it's got very low phenolics, and so we are able. And I've always made Sauvignon Blanc with machine harvested fruit. It's much more forgiving. But at Greywacke, we never pick Riesling, Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, anything else by machine. We pick it by hand because it's got a thick skin and it's high in phenolics. And we want to make wines that age gracefully and are not phenolic and haven't got a lot of color. if people ask me if I'm ever going to make an orange wine, I tell them that if they ever hear that Greywacke has released an orange wine, they'll know that I'm dead and that my son's taken over. In fact, I think I've even convinced him now that we would never do that. So we are absolutely the polar opposite of the orange wine thing. I hate phenolics, or I like to minimize phenolics. And with these wines, we don't actually add sulfur dioxide. We do add sulfur dioxide because you can't make white wine without it. If you ever hear I've made Greywacke's released a natural wine, you'll also know I'm dead. I strongly believe that that sulfur dioxide used very carefully is very much a part of making great white wines that age well, and that's what we do. But you can add too much, and you can add it too soon. We don't. With a Chardonnay, we hand pick it, we whole bunch press it. We whole bunch press it straight to barrel. So every barrel is a little bit different from each other because we're filling barrels as we press, and we don't add sulfur dioxide until it's all in the barrel. Sometimes not till the next day. To let any phenolics diminish, and also to let any well, usually with hand-picked fruit we haven't got botrytis issue, but certainly if we have got botrytis in the Riesling or Pinot Gris, we like to let the juice sit with oxygen for some time to deactivate the effect of botrytis. And then with the Chardonnay, as I said, it's 100% wild, so we don't add any yeast. We don't add, other than a little tiny bit of sulfur dioxide, we don't add anything actually. And then it ferments much as I described the wild Sauvignon. So it's fermented without any attempt to control the fermentation. And then this wine, we allow the whole lot to go through malolactic. Did I say with the wild Sauvignon, we aim for about 2/3 malolactic and 1/3 non-malolactic. With the Chardonnay, 100% of it goes through malolactic. And it's and the wild Sauvignon, the Chardonnay, we leave it in barrel for 12 months, and 20% of the barrels are new, and they're quite heavy toast. So when you smell that wine, it's very savory, and a lot of people, well, some people think that we've used a bit too much oak, or it's quite dominated by oak, but lots of those savory characters are not oak, are not coming from oak at all. Because we're pressing straight to barrel, we get a lot of solids, so it's very cloudy juice. And when you ferment a cloudy juice with wild yeast, you often get a lot of sulfide production. This is not sulfites, this is sulfide, so hydrogen sulfide. So the barrel cellar smells like Rotorua. I don't know if you know what Rotorua smells like, but it smells like a geothermal area. It smells quite awful actually, but so the wine becomes very reductive once with these high solids juices. But that reductive character, given time, we don't try and stop it, and we don't. In fact, we like it. That's what gives the wine that sort of really struck match, flinty, that character. So we got the barrel, and we got the heavy toast, we got the flintiness, we got, and the wild yeast. If someone asked me to describe wild yeast, I quite often use the words linseed and lanolin. And wild yeast fermentations can and quite often do for us produce those sort of characters. So they're also savory characters. So it's not, the savoriness you're getting from this wine is certainly not all coming from the barrel. What do you think of the wine? Are you enjoying it?
Yes, I'm seeing a lot of smiles and head nodding and repetitive sipping. So it looks like it's a great
What
success.
vintage have you got there?
Oof, I'll pull it up. Jared, I don't remember. Do you guys, anyone in the audience, have the vintage handy? No, we'll get it back to you. I want to say it's 18, but I could be wrong.
No, it's not 18. See the anyway, it doesn't matter. But this wine lasts a long. I mean, the very first one we made, the 09 is still really drinking well, and the 10 and the 11 are both excellent. See, this is
excellent.
It's a wine that sellers, it sellers very well. In fact, it's oh, 16, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks, guys. All right, so I'm pulling up now for the Pinot Noir, but you're welcome to go ahead and get started with it.
So New Zealand, the one wine other than Sauvignon Blanc that has gained some significant international profile for New Zealand, well, so it is Pinot Noir, and there's no doubt at all that New Zealand is producing some really, really superb Pinot Noir. And you'll find excellent Pinot Noir growing I don't normally talk so much. It's a fairly quiet life in this part of the valley. In fact, someone said to me, this was about a month ago, we were locked down because of COVID, and someone said, what's it like down there being locked down? I said, it's not much different to when it's not locked down. So yeah, New Zealand has fairly quickly, well, in a space of 2 or 3 decades, developed a very high profile for Pinot Noir in New Zealand. And I suppose in Marlborough, we were, 30 years ago, we were focusing fairly heavily on Sauvignon Blanc, whereas a place like Martinborough in the lower North Island was focusing on Pinot Noir, and then the Central Otago region, further down the South Island, also started focusing on Pinot Noir, and those guys they just nailed it. They're making some superb wines from the get-go. In Marlborough, a lot of the Pinot Noir that was planted here in those early days was actually more destined for sparkling wine. We had clones that were a lot of Swiss clones, clones like Bactobel and Mariafeld. And when we first started playing with Pinot Noir at Cloudy Bay, the best clone we had was AM 10/5, which is now considered our least clone. And we were growing it in the stony, Greywacke river gravels, which we thought would be a good place to grow red grapes. Stony soils, retaining heat and all those sort of theories, but it proved to not be the case. And so we had to find the right place to grow it, because we were growing it in the wrong place, and we had to get the better clones. So that's what happened over a period of something like 20 years. So we got in Marlborough, and I'm talking about Marlborough here, not about anything that I was specifically involved in. And we brought in the Dijon clones, the clones with romantic names like 777, 667, 115. We got all those clones in here. We planted, and then about 20 or so years ago, an irrigation scheme was put in that reticulated water around what we call the southern valleys. And the southern valleys are sort of tributary valleys to the south of the main Wairau Valley. Actually, just talking about Marlborough. Marlborough is divided into 2 main river systems: the Wairau system and the Awateri system. And we are in the Wairau. The Awateri is to the south of us, and we have sourced a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc from there, but we don't anymore, and we don't source any of our other wines from there. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the Awateri, it's just not our preference, and that's not where we're located. So we concentrate on the Wairau, and then so the Wairau is the main valley that flows east-west. It flows from the west to the east, and then to the south of that are these tributaries called the southern valleys. and the Southern Valleys are totally and utterly different to the main Wairau. The main Wairau is like sort of a sandy loam mixed in with all this river, all these rounded river stones. But the Southern Valleys are all clay, largely clay, and they say that these valleys were formed from wind-blown glacial dust. So there was glaciers further up the valley a long time ago, and the grinding of the rock produced dust, and it was blown down, and it settled on these and formed these hills, and they are literally big, big lumps of clay. And once we started growing, so it was very hard to get vineyards established in these soils in the early days without irrigation, but the irrigation gave us an opportunity to start developing vineyards on these hills. They with the right sort of more irrigation management, the vineyards become self-sufficient after a certain amount of time. So because the soil holds so much moisture, but to get them going, the irrigation is very useful. So and once we got the better clones, the Dijon clones growing in these hillsides and in the clay soils, then that's when we started to turn a corner in Marlborough. And that's when we started to make much better Pinot Noir. And now that we've got some vine age, and we're talking like, and they're not old vines, but we've now got vines that are sort of 20 years old on average for a Greywacke Pinot. And we are really producing some, well, we as in Marlborough are producing some excellent Pinot Noirs. But you've got to keep in mind when you're looking to buy Marlborough Pinot Noir is that Marlborough is a very big region, and it's the home of a lot of corporates and a lot of people that grow grapes purely for one reason, to make money. And there are Marlborough Pinot Noir is not all the same. Well, not all of Marlborough wine is all the same. Some Marlborough Pinot Noir is grown and picked by machine and cropped up, and it produces good quality entry-level wine, no doubt about it. But the good stuff is largely coming from the hillsides, from the Southern Valleys, from the Awatere, and it's coming from people that from vineyards that are close planted, and it's been made with a bit more love and a bit more attention to quality. So when you need to do a little bit of research. I'm not sure how many Marlborough Pinot Noirs you've got in the market there, but there's a whole raft of different levels of quality of Marlborough Pinot Noir, but the good stuff is now as good as anywhere in New Zealand. We tend to make wine, so Pinot Noir, you'll find good quality Pinot Noir growing from the lower end of the North Island, so mainly from the area called Wairarapa, and then all through the South Island. All the regions of the South Island produce very good Pinot Noir. I'm not sure why Hawke's Bay doesn't produce better Pinot Noir than it does. I mean, it is warmer, but you'd think in a cooler year they would make better Pinot Noir, but I think their focus up there is on other varieties. So they're not trying hard enough, is what I think. So, so the Greywacke Pinot is almost entirely grown on hillsides. These are not high elevation vineyards by any means. They're not that much higher than sea level, to be honest. But the difference is that they're on different soils to the main valley. They're on sort of clay soils, as I said, and they've got various different aspects and they've got a little bit of frost protection. They tend to the Pinot Noir ripens significantly earlier on the hillsides than it does down the valley floor, which can be an advantage and sometimes can be a disadvantage, depending on when we've seen this in 2018. It was absolutely a disadvantage because we had considerable amount of rain just as harvest was beginning. So anything that was ripe at that time, which was just this hillside, the best hillside stuff, got hit by the rain. Anyway, so there you go. So mainly Dijon clones, hillside sites, beautiful. They're beautiful vineyards. They're just stunning. In fact, that picture of me on the and my old dog on the front of that video. I don't know if you can still see that, but that's the top of. Can we pull that one up? Just to not play the video, but just pull up that photograph, please. Can you see that? So that can you see that now?
Everyone should be able to see that.
Okay, so that's I'm standing at the top of Greywacke. I don't remember if I said that. Well, I said that we saw 75% of our fruit from the Sutherlands. The other 20 odd percent comes from a couple of other growers, and Kimberly and I own 1 hectare of hillside Pinot Noir, and that's me standing at the top of that 1 hectare there in the middle of summer a couple of years ago. So that's quite a steep hillside block, and then you can't quite see it, but the winery where I'm sitting right now is actually it's down in the center of that valley, just off to the right of the screen. So that's where we are. But this is what the Southern Valleys look like. So this is the Omaka Valley. So there's the Waihopai, the Omaka, the Brancott, and the Ben Morven are the 4 main Southern Valleys, and they all look fairly like this. So there's sort of a hills on either side, and I think probably without a doubt, without too much generalization, the best Pinot Noir is coming from the various sites on these hills around these valleys. But I mean, the valley floors also produce some pretty damn good Pinot Noir, but also extremely good sites for growing Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, and any other thing. To be fair, the thing we don't do very well here is Bordeaux Reds, or any of the sort of the warmer climate Spanish, Italian type of varieties, because we just don't get the heat units. It is a cool climate. I think there's some pretty good potential here for Syrah or Shiraz. In New Zealand we call it Syrah. I think there is potential for that, especially if someone. And I'm tempted to put some Syrah on some of that sort of hillside and treat it like Pinot Noir and see what can be made, because there is some Pinot Noir, there is some Syrah being made in Marlborough, but I think most of it's being grown on flat sites and not probably given quite as much love as we tend to give to Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir gets all the love. I mean, the fruit costs us a ridiculous amount of money to grow. You wouldn't believe it. You can't get anything wrong when you're growing Pinot Noir. I mean, you can't. You've got to get everything right. So it's 100% wild ferment. Can I keep talking about?
Well, thank you very much for that. And yes, we would love for you to keep talking for a very long time. There's just so much to learn from you. Hopefully we could repeat this masterclass with the next vintages coming up, if you're willing and able, next year. And hopefully we'll be able to get even more of a range for everyone to sample and enjoy. These wines, the 3 wines, are what's available at the moment, and we look forward to getting our hands on everything else that is in the market when the time is right. We did have one question that I just want to get out there before we say goodnight, and we'll give everyone an opportunity to ask any questions after Kevin answers this question. You guys are welcome to put your questions up in the chat box. So Jaron asked, what were some of the most surprising developments in the wild fermentation of the Sauvignon Blanc?
So what do you mean?
Jaron, if you want to jump on.
I was just kind of getting at, like, obviously you have those micro, organisms and everything growing in there. What was the kind of the craziest things that you've seen during that process as being just left it alone in barrel? Or maybe nothing happened. I don't know.
It sounds probably a little bit more risque than it really is. We do get the occasional batch that goes a bit crazy. We get the occasional batch that sort of decides it's not going to ferment anywhere past 20 grams per litre, which is a pain in the ass. I mean, this is pre-Greywacke, but I remember the very first experimental batch that we made at Cloudy Bay with Chardonnay. And in fact, it wasn't my idea, because at the time I employed a guy called James Healy at Cloudy Bay, and he was the founder of Dog Point after he left Cloudy Bay with Ivan Sutherland. And it was James's idea to use wild yeast. I thought it was a stupid idea, and I told him so. In fact, I used a different word to that, or I put another adjective in front of it. But he kept nagging me that he wanted to experiment with wild yeast, and he'd been inspired by what Michael Brajkovic was doing up in Kubian River with wild yeast in New Zealand. And he eventually got under my skin, and I said, okay, we'll do a trial. And so I think we had about 8 barrels that we filled up with perfectly good, pristine Chardonnay juice, and left it to its own devices, and the whole winery just stunk. It just was disgusting. It was like Rotorua had come to Marlborough. And I was convinced that we'd be tipping this down the drain, because back then a stinky ferment was just not something that winemakers could cope with. I mean, you had to stop the stink. I mean, that's what you do. That's what winemakers do. They add stuff to stop things like that going on. Anyway, he didn't want to do that, so he wanted to leave it, which I also thought was stupid. But yeah, the stink from that was crazy, and now we just love it. I mean, we expect that to happen. But you just need to be patient. You need to wait, and the stink goes away, and it turns into something quite delicious if you're patient.
All right, well, we'll
I'm not
take
sure if I answered that very well, Jaren. But anyway,
I'm sure Jaren's happy with it. Yeah, you always see those amazing pictures of ferments just wildly gone wrong, and thanks to social media, we see some pretty epic stuff. So it's good to hear that there's nothing too drastic happening at Greywacke.
How can you see a ferment that's gone wrong? I think you can smell it.
Sort of like too much yeast or something, and the barrels explode, or there's something gone wrong.
Sometimes they do go. Sometimes they certainly flow. They certainly froth and flow over. But that's not necessarily part of the wild yeast thing. It's just putting too much juice in the barrel and a bit of bad luck.
Expensive bad luck in this case. All right, we're a small group. It's maybe our only opportunity to talk to Kevin directly. So if you guys have any questions, I'm going to take a pause and give about 15 seconds of dead air time. And if anyone has any questions or comments that you'd like to add, please jump on, and we'll get started now. Okay, cool. All right, so you guys are all set. Thank you so much for attending, everyone. We're really delighted to have had the opportunity to share this masterclass with each and every one of you. Now you're all advocates of the wines from Greywacke. Before we say goodnight and close up the masterclass, Kevin, do you have any final words to share with us this evening?
Well, I'd just like to say that thanks for coming along, and thanks for not making me get on an airplane.
Excellent. Well, it's funny you say we only have 4 out of your 7 wines here in the US. So it sounds like all of us need to take a trip to New Zealand and come taste the remaining wines. So thanks for giving us a reason to come fly over there when your borders open. You've been very strict, so maybe not for a couple of years. And
well, it has been very strict here.
Yeah,
it's been crazy strict. And but Delta has got loose up in Auckland. And we've got 1 case in Blenheim now, so we just need to get the country vaccinated so we can sort of relax like the rest of the world and let it do its thing.
Right.
But yeah, we've been stuck here for nearly 2 years now, so it's been quite good to catch up on a few jobs at home. But I do love traveling, and when I come to this picture on the wall I shot last trip to the US, which was early 2019, I think. The landscape in your country is just phenomenal, just staggering.
Well, yeah, definitely. When you come to DC, look us up, Cork and Fork. Don't forget about us. Jaren put in a good word, and we'll send an invite to everyone who attended this evening to maybe do a smaller in-person masterclass. Nalini asked a wonderful question. I'm going to follow up with you by email, Nalini, but I'm respectful of everyone's time this evening. And thank you again, everyone, for joining. So have a wonderful night. Good night, and we'll see you all very, very soon. Take good care. See you guys.
Thanks, everyone.